we're going to go to the slide, or we're going to go to the water fountain or something like that. You give them two very discrete choices to be made when you walk out the door, so that they know which direction they're going in. Otherwise, they feel you're in a state of chaos. And that's part of the autism, to feel that world is chaotic, that the sense of predictability, of compartmentalization isn't there neurobiologically from the beginning, so they can't fill in those little boxes with good behavior. You have to give them little boxes to fill in.
Welcome back to Mother's Guide Through Autism. I am Bridget Shipman. I'm your host, and I am going to be speaking with Susan P. Sherkow, MD. And I am so excited to learn from you, Susan. So welcome to Mother's Guide Through Autism.
Thank you very much. It's a thrill to be here. I'm so excited about the kind of work you've done and the contribution that you've made, along with the guests that you've had on your program over these numbers of years. It's really fantastic.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled because I know, being a teacher, educator, life coach, but mostly a mom of a child who is, everyone knows that follows us, that Joseph is now 32. I can't even believe it. And just some of the hardships that come along with the role of being a mom. I want to just briefly mention that you are a key figure in the developmental psychoanalytic modalities, which is a mouthful. So I'll let you speak about exactly what that means for us that are like, I get the psychoanalytical part. Also, that you have worked with children and adolescents and really have done the clinical research and findings that have offered so many answers, which we're going to get into today. Would you tell us, how did you get to where you're at? How did you decide you wanted to work in this community?
Well, it's been something that I've been fascinated by from the very beginning of my training, actually, because when I was still a resident at Einstein, where I trained, and then went on to be a child fellow. But even when I was a resident, there was a wonderful professor of psychiatry, and Dr. Eleanor Galenson, in fact, and she had two nurseries that she ran at Einstein. One was for children who were developing neurotypically, and they were mostly the children mothers. In those days, mothers didn't work to the extent that they do now. So mothers and wives, actually, of the staff, the house staff, but mothers who'd just given birth and had nowhere to go to get mothering help, and very lonesome because their husbands had full-time jobs at the hospital. She started a nursery for this group of moms and babies, and we volunteered in the nursery. So we were assigned one mother-child pair to follow every day. If we could go to the nursery every day, if we had the time to do that, and at least several times a week, we would interview the mother and watch the baby and take notes. So that was our job, to do research for her and her study of what little girls were like compared to little boys. In fact, she put that difference in developmental awareness of self, of other, of one's body parts. She put that on the map along with her colleagues at the time. And the other thing we did was go to her nursery for therapeutic children's needs. It was I think it was actually called the therapeutic nursery or something like that. And we would volunteer there as well and work with the mother and baby who were not developing typically. They were usually over 6 months or so, because you don't know that a child's not developing typically until they're at least 6 or 7 months. But some of them were already having difficulties, or the mother-baby relationship was in trouble. But in any case, by the time they were 1 or 1.5, they would be showing differences. And that's where I first encountered autistic children. kids who were not developing neurotypically, and we worked with them to see what was going on between the mother and the baby and to try to help them as best we could without interfering, which was a kind of tall order because it was to observe, not to intervene. So one of the first things we learned about was how you learn by observing and holding your tongue. So, which is very important ultimately in working with children on the spectrum, even as a therapist, knowing what to say to a parent and what not to say, what to say to a child, where you should step in and help, and where you should just sit back and wait as best you can till things evolved, according to some other developmental model, but not everything at once. It's very overwhelming to share what you know about a child and a parent all at the same, you learn a lot instantly, but you can't share it. It has to be developmentally sequential. So that was my background. And I continued to work with the occasional child on the spectrum as a child fellow when someone came to the clinic with such a diagnosis. But most of what I learned about working with this population came about through my private practice when I would be referred someone on the spectrum. And that was kind of random. I mean, it was not, I didn't have a reputation for working with kids on the spectrum, and there really weren't that many youngsters on the spectrum back in the day. So when I started to work with one of these children whose mother was a very, very difficult woman, I realized there was a whole dimension of understanding that had been stuck in the days of icebox mothers, that mothers were held responsible for the child being on the spectrum. And there was this particular little boy whom I saw analytically by dint of just telling the mom, I think he needs to come every day because we're not going to make much progress if he only comes once a week. But no one had ever thought of seeing children like this little boy who was 3 or 3.5 years old, 4 times a week. It was really novel. So I began to develop something that became part of who I am today, which is someone who espouses working intensively with children in a psychoanalytically oriented way, as you described earlier. We do developmental thinking about children rather than doing behavioral treatment. We address the behaviors, but underlying the behaviors are developmental issues between the mother and the baby. The trajectory of the baby's development is not what it should be. We have to figure out what's wrong and how to help that child get back on developmental trajectory. Now, those are very big words, so probably should.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you. So can you say more about that? Because what I'm hearing is that you don't just treat the symptom, you go beneath that and try and figure out what the why is. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, we keep in mind what a baby looks like as the baby evolves. So just in the most basic way, babies start off by being fairly lumps, like someone would describe it. They're lying there in their crib and they may be cooing a little bit if you coo to them, and they're waving their hands around, but they don't really show much personality. What comes about is the mother brings out the child's personality by having little babbling conversations with the baby, right? You try to make contact with the baby with fingers, with hands, with touch, and in between feedings, your baby may be alert enough to be there to play with, but some babies just sleep and eat. So some children have an early developmental trajectory where they only sleep and eat, and there's not much opportunity for the mother to play with the baby and coo and talk. But eventually, all babies become more little persons in between the feeding and sleeping. And that's where the mother's personality and the baby's personality come to life, and they match each other or not. And that's one of the things we learned early on, that there are mothers who expect very active babies, but the baby's kind of passive and just prefers to lie there and needs a lot of engagement to be brought forward. Or there are babies who are extremely active and the mothers get overwhelmed. I can't keep up with my baby. They want so much from me. They're constantly demanding, and I feel I'm not giving them enough if I don't respond constantly to them. So having a good match is something that was put on the map by another colleague of mine back at Einstein, Sybil Escalona, who understood that it was important to recognize whether the mother and baby were a good match and to help them develop support systems if in case they weren't. So one of the things that probably was going on, there were children under the radar who were developmentally different, but we didn't recognize it. We just saw someone where the mother and baby weren't quite as well matched and they needed some help to feel like they were more comfortable with each other, so the mothers would not become anxious. And one of the things I've learned over time is that a big problem for this mother-baby pair is if the mother looks at her baby and the baby's not doing exactly what she thought the baby would do, the baby doesn't seem to be responding as well, or making good eye contact, or making some kind of demand or a not demand when mother has an expectation. And then you feel like, oh my goodness, my baby's not perfect. My baby's not doing what he should be doing. And mom gets a little anxious about that and can easily transmit that anxiety to the baby if she's so anxious that the baby can't really hold mom's gaze, which can cause gaze aversion or other kinds of avoidant behavior. Now, most children on the spectrum don't emerge that early from their mother-baby unit.
Yeah.
It isn't the case until the baby's 1 year old or 15, 16 months that you begin to see any sign of, oh my goodness, there's something wrong with this picture. I was expecting the baby to be talking more or to be moving more or to be more engaged, and they're not. And that kind of picture is one that we've become much more familiar with, where the mother is unfortunately going to be anxious about the child not speaking and go to pediatrician and begin the whole process of making a diagnosis if there is one to be made. So that's where most of my more recent work has come into play. We try to get involved with those mothers and babies as early as possible to help.
Yeah, I saw in your bio that you're on the child psychiatry faculties of Albert Einstein, which you mentioned, the College of Medicine, and then Mount Sinai Hospital, where you are teaching child development. And so we moms, because I coach moms and I help them navigate the emotional side of this journey. What are with that experience and all the knowledge you have, what do we look for? What are some of where yes, you start noticing, like for and every child's different, but yet also the same when you start looking into should I get my child diagnosed or not, right? So Joseph was like had vocabulary galore until he was about 12 months old. And then everything started shifting. He was always very sensitive, but he did speak. And then his sentences structures, and he just regressed a bit. And so it's hard, right? So what do we do? What do we look for when we first start going, what's your advice?
Well, there's a set of markers that we look for in babies. One is stranger anxiety at 7 months or so. And that suggests in a neurotypical child that the baby recognizes that mother's face is different from someone else's face. So one of the things we've learned is that some of the children don't have stranger anxiety because they haven't really internalized, that's the big word for us. They haven't taken in or cued mother as a person and having a face that's recognizable by comparison to another face. And the whole process of cueing, which is part of the developmental line that I was referring to earlier, is really important in understanding the neurobiology of autism. But our guess is that the brains of these children don't pick up the signals about mother as a separate person, because they don't even pick up the signal about mother as a person to the extent to which mother has a mind of her own that she's communicating to the baby. And then that's reflected in the baby having a mind of his own that he communicates to mother. A very big piece of being 1.5 to 2 years old is developing that toddler resistance to mother's demands, right? The baby goes away when mommy calls. The baby wants to have his own independent life because he can. He can run away from mommy, go into another room. Mommy calls, he comes back. If a child's on the spectrum, it's not going to play out in the same way. Mom's expectation is the child will recognize that I'm mother, and to see me when I call him, he'll turn around when I call his name. If I point to something, he'll join attention with me. We'll point to something together. I play with a toy. I read him a book. His attention is where my attention is. If your child's not doing that, if he ignores you when you call his name, if he doesn't turn around when you say, come get your breakfast, or here's a donut or whatever, right? You begin to feel very anxious as a parent. Oh my goodness, what's wrong? And that is the time when one should definitely get an intervention, because we can turn that around. One thing we know is that if we start working with children under 2, there hasn't been one that we haven't turned around with that early work, because we can help the mother-child bond, join attention, help the child be trained to recognize self and other, have awareness of himself, awareness of mother, being a separate person, and then the language system comes back into play. So yes, we do hear often that children have been babbling and cooing and sounding like they're repeating their mother's words, but then it seems to just disappear when some part of their brain seems to have changed or evolved in a different direction. We don't know why that is. All the neuroscience I've studied, it doesn't explain why those children seem so regressed. The only explanation I personally have is that there is an anxiety that takes over when mom realizes her child is not following the developmental trajectory, is not understanding that she's a separate person, but also that he is his own person, that he has agency, that he can make choices, that he can think for himself. And that anxiety floods the brain to the extent to which they lose language and lose a sense of being their own agent.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I know it's so hard from the parent perspective, because denial is so very powerful, because I know, because I was definitely in and out of that. But I really enjoyed listening to your TEDx talk, and you talk about how you realized later in your career, very much about what we're talking about, that the neuroscience plays a major role in gaining the understanding of people who are on the spectrum. So for moms like me, could you explain that in layman's terms?
Sure. There's a number of things that are different in the brains of children on the spectrum. For one, when they're born, they have a bigger volume of brain tissue, and often their heads are bigger as well because they have a bigger volume of brain tissue. And one thing that is supposed to happen in any case is you start pruning the cells of your brain when you start putting information into cells. When a child is on the spectrum, apparently they don't put enough information into those cells, so they don't prune as many cells. And that adds a complexity to the way the brain is developing and using information. So as though if I'm cueing something in my mother, I'm taking that information and parking it in some part of my brain that consolidates that part of the brain. So those cells gather around that information, and cells that are being used to do that just disappear. That's called pruning. It's like packing for a trip. You throw everything in your closet on the sofa and you decide, I'm going to take this, this, and this. So you take those things out, put them in the suitcase, and you put the rest of the clothes back. That's how the brain works. It picks up information, fills up some amount of cells, and discards the rest. We know this in parallel for children who are born blind, congenitally blind. They have a larger visual component of their brain than they should have because they don't prune. They don't take in visual information to put into those cells and then prune away or get rid of the rest of the cells. So they have a different looking brain. And that's the comparison we make with children on the spectrum in some part. Now, as you know, and I've listened to your podcast, so I know a number of people have told you this, no two people with autism are the same. If you know one autistic person, you know one autistic person.
Yes.
Two
Yeah.
of the brains as well.
Mhm.
Another reason that isn't usually mentioned about why each autistic person is different from each other is because everyone has their own parents. Autism only impacts the brain in some particular way, not the same way for everyone by any means. It impacts some people visually, some people auditorially, some people like a dyslexic kind of a brain. It can not influence your language system at all, or it can devastate your language system, as two different extremes, right? So some kids don't develop language and some have fabulous language. So how is that? Well, because we don't know why autism impacts one part or another. But in any case, everybody has their parents' genes, but only their parents' genes, and only in that combination, since no siblings are the same either. So a very large part of an autistic person has nothing to do with autism. It has to do with their parent or their parents. They have blue eyes, they have shyness, they're good tennis players, they're balletic, they're not balletic, they're athletic, they're not athletic. If you think of all the different possibilities we all have individually, why would we be the same if we're autistic? I mean, it doesn't.
True.
Yeah, it never made any sense that you would expect every autistic person to be just like every other one. So it's very complex. Another part of the neuroscience is and I think you also know this from other of your interviewers, that the two parts of the brain, the left brain and the right brain, are not as well connected as they are in a neurotypical child. There's some difference in the connectivity. There's also clinically a difference between how we process information that's in the cognitive part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and how we process information that's emotional. And one of the things that we are very fond of saying is that our job is to connect the emotional brain with the cognitive brain, because the autism somehow, we don't know how, impacts the connectivity between the emotional aspects of brain and visual aspects, auditory aspects, all the sensory aspects, and the prefrontal cortex, which develops something called myelin sheaths. I don't know if you're familiar with it, like making a straw to cover a nerve. We make myelin to cover nerves, and as we cover nerves with myelin, they make connections with each other. So we go from having some isolated areas of information in parts of the brain to having connected areas of connectivity from one part to the other. And that's how we learn to think, to write, to read, and to have motor activity that's connected to understanding the motor activity. So babies, for example, will pick up a rattle, or they'll touch mother's face. They don't know that they're doing that in the sense of cognitively knowing that I'm touching mother's face, but they intuitively or in a sensory way know. Children on the spectrum have lots of sensory experiences, but they can't organize them. So another thing we know about autism is that the piece that's missing from these children's brains is the ability to predict and organize and compartmentalize. And that's what therapies all do. What we all have in common, different kinds of therapies all have in common, organizational pieces to make sense out of what's going on in the world, to organize it into lists or compartments of ideas or compartments of toys or compartments of meaningful expressions. This is the kind of emphasis we put based on the neurobiology of compartmentalization, which is how it maps and patterns and predictability that we rely on in the neurotypical education. And we have to bring that to these children. It doesn't come naturally.
Yeah, I think of the executive functioning, that you hear about, which my son also struggles with. But then he'll also surprise me because I'll think, and I have so many conversations with different moms about, how do I connect, with my child, how do you know, how do you have such a, because Joseph and I have such a strong relationship, and I just simply say it's because I know we speak two different languages.
Mhm.
And I know that Joseph processes things differently because he'll surprise me and I think he didn't hear anything that I said. And then he'll come back with this profound one-liner. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, it seems that he did understand. And not only that, he understands more than I do. So I think about that, about, moms struggling with the disconnect that is often experienced between an autistic child and everything that you're talking about with the mom, because they don't understand each other. So I look at it like we speak two different languages, and then I have to learn how to speak his, and he has to learn how to speak mine. Is that kind of what I'm hearing, that I'm understanding it on the neuroscience part of it? It's just that certain parts of the brain are not connecting like a neurotypical person. And so we have to figure out how we connect and communicate. And
Yes, yes. And a very good example would be the child who's either echolalic by virtue of copying something that they've heard on a television set, or often an advertisement, something that has a kind of a jingo-ish sound to it that sounds like it's an operational idea, but it has actually no clear operational sense to the parent is listening, like cars for talk, cars for talk, or wherever that crazy jingle goes. But it means something to the child because when they've heard that, it resonates with something that they're feeling, and they can sing that song and know that it's going to bring them either comfort or understanding or whatever function it has, right? But it doesn't have the function of communicating with the parent that you would like to have. So on the other hand, we know that it has that function, and therefore we use that to kind of deconstruct wherever that jingo came from, right?
yeah, yeah,
Cars for kids is what you're thinking about. Well, let me think now. Why would you be thinking about cars for kids? Maybe you want to go for a ride. Maybe you're feeling some kind of joyous feeling that you wish your mommy was in the car with you. And so we try to take it as a sort of symbolic representation of something the child's trying to communicate. And instead of rejecting it out of hand, which parents have had the tendency to do, like, oh my God, I can't stand this. My kid keeps singing this sing-songy thing. We say, well, wait a minute. Let's see if we can understand that. Let's see if we could figure out what is cars for kids. So if I were playing with a child and that's what they were saying, I might take out a car, then I might take out a little toy child, and then I might say, oh, this little boy wants to have a car. This is a car for this little kid. He wants to have this car. He wants to play with this car. Let me make this car play, and then I'll play some scenario where the child in this little scenario is not him, because he might feel too fragile for me to say, well, this is about you. So I displace it. Kids on the spectrum love displacement. They learn a lot by letting them know, we're not talking about you. Don't worry. This isn't about you. This is about this little boy. And that takes the anxiety off of him, so he can play with this little baby kitty car and baby little kitty toy and make some kind of story out of it. And whatever he does with it, well, I just put that into words, and now we have a story that we're sharing. That highlights, by the way, another piece of the problem that children have in this world of autism, which is performance anxiety, both on their part and on their parents' part. So once a child feels like his parents expect him to perform whatever that is, I go to the kitchen and get your milk, or show me you know how to use the potty, or show me you know how to say hello to grandpa. I'm not doing any of that. I'm not performing for you. It just makes me more anxious to perform for you. Then, of course, the anxiety becomes circular. Now parents are upset that their child's not performing by doing what they asked, and everything falls apart. So we deconstruct that all the time. We help parents take the onus off the child to perform for them by playing something that's not performance oriented, but something the child can perform on his own by having, again, agency. He can make something happen that we're very much engaged in, not watching or not taking a measurement of, but just being there to play together with anything at all that isn't a performance mode.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. As you're describing all that, I can so relate to all of that with my son Joseph. Just the he was definitely echolalic. He definitely, I like the meaningless behaviors are meaningful, because he would take phrases from the Disney movies that he was watching, and he would use phrases from that to try to communicate with me. And it was very much like charades, but it did mean something.
Yes.
And just exactly what you said, and following their lead and trying to figure out. And I love the suggestion of the play, because I think we can learn so much when when you talk about the anxiety, all of that. I could just go down my list and go check, 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 all of that. All I was under every bit of that umbrella, and I believe Joseph was too. And so I think this is such great information to be able to truly understand it. So then you know how to reach your child, how to connect with them on a much deeper level, because it is so complex. It is very complex. So I know moms, and generally everyone, whether you're a mom, a teacher, or whatever, would really benefit. Are there practical steps that moms can take at home? Just everything that we're talking about. You mentioned the play. Is there anything else we could be doing at home to make that connection with our kids?
Well, I love the idea that you're helping parents do this very practical and very pragmatic approach to their children, because first of all, you're indirectly and actually directly speaking to the connectivity altogether, that connecting with your child is so important, and believing you can connect with your child is so important, because it's so scary for a child when they feel like their parent can't connect to them and they desperately know they want to, and vice versa. But imagine if you're that little one whose mom just doesn't know what to say, what to do, looks at you like you're foreign object almost, because sometimes it feels like that the child is doing things and saying things that just don't fit in to what the family is doing at the moment, whether sitting down to eat or getting into the car and putting on a seatbelt, or taking a walk on the sidewalk and holding your hand and just wanting to go together and have fun, and your child just not understanding what you're trying to do. So we think in terms of giving these children very clear, predictable behavioral modeling at home, that starting with a routine. Even if your child resists, we think it's a good idea to have a routine and not to let their behavior disrupt the routine, because what can happen is if the child realizes that your anxiety is more important than their behavior, they'll take advantage of you being anxious and they'll corrupt the work that you're trying to do to make something happen, because children on the spectrum are stuck at terrible twos. If you think about it, even when they're 14, they're still terrible twos. If they haven't evolved, and many of them haven't, they still challenge you every possible place they could challenge you. So instead of becoming oppositional in return, which often parents feel like they need to be, they demand, if you don't go to school sitting in the car seat, I'm going to tie you up and put you in the trunk. What a father just told me that the other day. That's how he got his daughter to school. What, are you kidding me? You told her you would tie her up in the trunk, and she got,
Wow.
I mean, I know she didn't believe him, but then I don't know that she didn't believe him, because then she would get in the car seat. Or similarly, a school teacher said about a little youngster, 12-year-old, who didn't want to go to school. Well, if she doesn't get out of bed, strip her bed around her till she gets out of bed. What? Are you? No. I
I'm
mean,
just like, yeah.
as oppositional as the child. So
Yes.
keeping in mind that your child can't help but be oppositional, it's the only way he can assert himself and make himself feel like he has any agency. We give them a routine often enough so they know there's a routine. So don't let them abort your routine, at least for some period of time. Like, let's say you're starting from scratch after hearing me talk. You say, okay, I'm going to go home. We're going to wake up at 8 o'clock. We're going to have breakfast at 8:30. You put on your clothes at 8:45. You brush your teeth, whatever order it is, you put that order in place. If you need to, you put that order on a piece of paper. Kids love lists, even if they pretend they don't. So you can write it all down. I mean, and some behavior modification approaches do this as well. So that's perfectly fine to make pictograms or lists, but this is how we proceed. It's predictable, it's routine, this is what we're doing. Now, if your child has had that experience for enough days in a row, so they know that's what's expected, and then you run into, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that, then you give them choices between two things. So choices between two things is always good. You can have milk or you can have orange juice. You can have Cheerios or you can have Rice Krispies. You can sit in this chair or you can sit in that chair. You can do that till you're blue in the face, but you should be blue in the face because that's what you should do. You keep giving them choices until they finally allow you a little bit of agency yourself, and they pick one of your choices. And by sticking with the two-choice plan, you always have an opportunity for the child to say, okay, I'm the boss. Okay, fine, you're the boss. You get to pick milk over orange juice. You can brush your teeth first or brush your teeth second. You can put your pajamas on now, or you can put them on later. You can have this book or you can have that book. But eventually they concede because they do want to be parented, and they get it that they can have some will, but not all the will. And you have something that you can give back to them, which is, okay, now we have a regulated day, and they want regulation. So the part of the brain that wants to be regulated and wants to please will be empowered, and the parent will feel empowered, and you get things done. So that's number 1, 2, 3, and 4. You don't ever say to a child something like, I don't know, you could do whatever, whichever way you want to do it, or some kind of open-ended scenario. Do you want to go to the park, or we're going to the park? No, we're going to go to the slide, or we're going to go to the water fountain or something like that. You give them two very discrete choices to be made when you walk out the door, so that they know which direction they're going in. Otherwise, they feel you're in a state of chaos. And that's part of the autism, to feel that world is chaotic. The sense of predictability, of compartmentalization isn't there neurobiologically from the beginning, so they can't fill in those little boxes with good behavior. You have to give them little boxes to fill in. And whichever way you can organize them, they can get organized. That's the therapy, in fact, that they're looking for, is to organize their brains.
Yeah, and I think that it sounds so simple, but I think the consistency of that, where the kids, at least what I have noticed, then begin to trust the system, and they do understand it, and maybe, not in every child, but I would think that the meltdowns and the, just the parents feeling out of control as well as the child feels out of control would help with that. Because, some moms will say, well, I've tried that, but they still throw fits. And I'm like, well, how long have you tried that? So what is your advice on, like, if you're gonna, like you said, I'm gonna go home, I'm gonna start from scratch, but my child is going to be defiant, and parents don't know how to set those boundaries. Like, what do you do when a child has a meltdown? How do you proceed with that?
The safest way to proceed is to ignore the meltdown and say, I think we need a break. I know you're feeling miserable, to identify the feeling. I know you're feeling miserable. I know you're feeling awful, and this is really awful for both of us, but let's just go get a coffee break and take a break if the child is in a safe enough place. Of course, if you have a history of meltdowns, we'd have to start rolling back this conversation to the first meltdown and having a safe place, and whether you would handle it by being soothing or you handle it by being punitive. I mean, those are all kinds of questions that parents ask as well. I mean, we don't believe in being punitive when a child's having meltdowns. And trying to be soothing and identify the feelings until they calm down is the best way to handle it if it's possible. But at the other end of your question is, when do you go see a professional? If your child's having meltdown after meltdown and you've tried all these things that I'm just describing, you might need medication.
Okay.
Or absolutely. I mean, from might to absolutely is a range of, or a spectrum of responses to the child. So I am a psychiatrist. I do medicate children. I don't medicate children for ADHD or, that I'm not really keen on medication just for the sake of trying to do medication of things that you don't want to medicate. So I'm not one of these people, a pill pusher by any means, but I have learned the hard way that children on the spectrum might and often do need medication, and it's a lifesaver for the child and the parents. So if a child's unable to respond, then, and some children are very much unable to respond, and it's not my plan here. It sounds so simple-minded, but it works for children who are cognitively enough intact to absorb those kinds of instructions from their parents, right? So if they're not, medication is a miracle.
Yeah.
And it helps organize those synapses that I was talking about earlier. So sometimes just loving care can organize synapses, and sometimes it's too difficult for them to do that. And the benefit of medication is it brings empowerment to the whole family. So it's very much worthwhile. And it's like magic sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great point, because as you are trying so hard to be, a good parent, whatever that is, I think parenting our kids is very different than what, how, let's say, I was raised in a neurotypical environment, right? And I knew how to follow rules and I knew the consequences, but I think it's really truly understanding. Again, I'm going to use that word because I think that's absolutely right. For the mom, if you've tried everything, it just parents, and it's not working, then there's more going on than just don't feel like you're not being a good parent. What I'm hearing is get help.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's just so much parents can do with wiring that is not responsive to environmental neurotypical parenting. And I mean, I don't know if this is your experience, but I think you just have one child, if I understand.
I have one child on the spectrum, and then he has a brother who is neurotypical.
We found there's a very big difference between children on the spectrum who are first children, or often then only children, or second, third, or fourth, because a parent is much more calm and relaxed around a child who's got differences if they've already had a neurotypical experience. So second children on the spectrum are very different from first children in most respects, because they've had a different kind of mother, just like second children are different from anybody.
Yes.
Children have more performance anxiety and more need to stretch because their parents need that from their first child, right? Their firstborn. And you also, if you're a second or third born with autism, you have one or two older brothers and sisters, or if you have a younger sibling, you learn from them. And mirroring your siblings is a very big part of what helps a child on the spectrum develop and thrive without that much parental input. So you have somebody you're modeling yourself after, somebody you're talking to, somebody who understands you, somebody you can share with. And each of these kids, whether it's the oldest or the youngest, if there's a pair, can benefit from the other one, and does, so.
Yeah, and Joseph, being the oldest by 5 years, I completely understand what you're saying, that, him, although his brother is 5 years younger, you know, he still was trying to keep up with his younger brother. And so I could see a lot of what you're saying in having an only child or the oldest child, well, what you're saying, just like neurotypical kids, the oldest seems to get the most pressure because the parents want them to perform, if you will. Yeah, because we really are so the expectation of parenting is so very different with the first one than it is with the second or third or fourth. I would love to ask you what advice you have for parents raising kids on the spectrum. I mean, you've given a lot of great steps and practical advice, but is there anything else you want to advice that you'd like to give?
But one thing we probably haven't mentioned is the whole question of a support system vis-a-vis groups of parents. And I haven't mentioned the fact that we also discovered that we could run groups of children on the spectrum, which helped them enormously, that other kids that they could identify. But using local youngsters who are not on the spectrum as their buddies, we've created a kind of group where every patient has one or two buddies who are volunteers from the neighborhood schools, and they are all together in a group. So there are layers of groups. Each child has their own little team, and then all the teams together create the group, and then the group does activities together as a group with team leaders and other volunteers. So we have a lot of social support in these various ways, that you get your individual attention from your little team, and then you get the attention of the whole group, and you also get no attention at all, which is part of the mystery of what makes it work, because you're not really the center of attention, and everybody's there doing all these things that you're kind of aware of and picking up vibes from. So it's a kind of multimedia experience. And I think parents can get the same pleasure, and it is a pleasure, from being in parent groups where they can share with other parents and commiserate. And I think there should be more parent groups with their kids. We haven't done it, but putting parents and children together as a group of groups so that they can learn from each other and share with each other in a way that gives you the different generations at the same place. Now that I'm talking to you about it, I'm thinking that we really should try it. Because I think parents can learn so much from each other, as well as from experiences like watching your podcasts. But being in rooms full of people that are just like you as well as different from you is what it's all about. You need to both learn from the people who share your ideas as well as people who are vastly different, because that's what makes us social.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I agree, because I think back, I've organized several support groups for parents, and I think some of the challenges are that they come for just a few answers, or I want to know how to help my child, like right now. But I think this is such a great conversation, because I would love to see parents just kind of slow down a bit and understand that this is a journey. We've got work to do. Yes, certainly you want answers. I did too. But along the way, just slowing down. And I think these groups are such a great idea about how to support the child, how to support the parents, and how to really build a community of understanding, because I feel like the workforce, and that's for another conversation another day, but I think there's autism awareness, but if we the parents don't understand it, how are we going to bring the rest of the world to catch up to this, because these diagnoses are only increasing. We're getting more and more children that are being diagnosed on with ASD. I think the last time I checked, which this could have changed because that's how quickly it changes, was 1 in 36 kids. So that's a lot. right?
And to your point, in terms of the slowing down and looking the long haul, when we treat these children, we see them for 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, individually and in group. I mean, the ones who are the most successful in terms of emerging from their neurodiversity to being less neurodiverse have been with us a long time, because you go through phases on a daily basis. But even if you didn't think about daily, we go through phases of development through latency, puberty, transitioning into pre-adolescence, adolescence. Your body's changing, your mind is changing. How can you manage that if you think you've got a quick fix that's going to be turned around in even a year? So it is long haul, and having support in a family way as well as in a group way for a long time is what's necessary. So you could keep learning about children as they evolve, and you evolve with your child too. So it is important to keep in mind it's a long time before they grow up.
Yes, yes, and they do, and it's so many moms want me to say some magical word that Joseph is no longer neurotypical, but he is. But that's okay. It's perfect because he is finally independent, living his life, but it doesn't happen overnight, is the moral to the story. It just doesn't. And I think each child has their own timeline, and not to get stressed out about what society's timeline is.
Exactly.
So I love that advice. Is there anything else you want to mention before we go?
Well, I feel like we leave too many stones unturned when you have these conversations, but I'm just reminded of how important it is to see a child through puberty, for example, and to see a child through their various life challenges, and know that there are going to be differences in their brain development, and some will make things worse for the moment and some will make things better, just because that's how it is. And again, we're genetically programmed to be more or less like our parent, so we're going to develop different bodies during our pubertal years and different bodies through adolescence, and then choices that get made around your gender and around your family dynamic for yourself, like what do you want for yourself as a young person, and never mind career choices and all the things that we haven't covered. So I guess, well, last but not least, keeping an open mind, but being there for your youngster as really a person of interest to them, not a person making demands on them at every phase of their development, but just like, well, who are they? And what do they want to be? But who are you? And how much do they want to be like you? But keeping that eye on the self-awareness and the other awareness as a trajectory of being able to be together without being suffocating
Yes.
or pushing too far away. It's a very hard, I don't know, like a helix, like the DNA helix, like interweaving different dynamics at all times is how we think. It gets kind of complicated, but it is complicated.
Yes. Yes, I would love for you to come back and just do an episode on adolescence, honestly, because I have, when I say a lot of moms that call me, I'm not exaggerating, and they say, adolescent wise, I cannot get him to come out of his room. He
Nope.
doesn't want to do anything. So I think that would be a great next interview. If I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I would love to have you back.
I'd love to, because I'd love to. Yes.
Okay. Well,
Thank you.
yeah. The other thing before we go is I want people to know where they can find you, because these listeners are going to want to know how to get help, how to work with you, how to connect with you. I know you've written a book, and give us some resources, things that you've done where folks can connect with you.
Well, we have a book that we've written a neuroscience and psychoanalysis by Sherkow and Harrison. So that's available for sale online, I think at Amazon. We also have a website, the sherkowcenter.org, which is something that we keep updating. And now we've got a new improved version, and we're getting new and improved people helping us as we learn more about how to do, because I'm very old fashioned. I avoided Instagram for the longest time, but we're trying to get into doing LinkedIn. We'll be doing a lot of blogging in addition to what we've already done, but increasing our blogging. I've just written a paper on gender and autism and looking at the difficulties and not so difficulties, depending on one's perspective, on what it's like to be autistic and to confront gender as a whole entity. So happy to talk about that, but hopefully have this paper published. We have something we're working on, the Sherkow Center method, to help understand how to think about youngsters. So those are the best ways to reach us on our website, or also we have an email. The Sherkow Center has its own email, so it's easy to find us that way.
Okay, and we will make sure that we list all this when we release this episode. So if a mom's driving, don't stress about it. You can listen to this episode again, or also we will post these links as we release this episode, because I know our listeners are going to want to contact you. And I'm so thankful that you were a guest. Thank you again. And I'm so glad you're going to come back.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this episode of A Mother's Guide Through Autism podcast, please subscribe and our channel, our YouTube channel, and help Joseph and I spread knowledge, hope, and inspiration. I'll see you in the next episode.